Like all of you out there, I've been watching with bated breath as the revolutions have swept through, first of all, Tunisia, then Egypt, then Libya, and now then Syria. What does it all mean? Who's agitating all of this? I mean, these things don't just all of a sudden spring up like dandelions on a spring morning. Instead, there are people behind who are making these things happen. There are events that are pushing it all. There's someone that's masterminding the whole thing. And so consequently, I've been trying to figure out what's going on here. Where did this come from? Who's planning this? Is this the CIA? Is it the Israeli Mossad? Is it somebody else? I simply have not been able to come up with the answer. However, I come across an article today in the Haaretz newspaper, which is one of the leading publications in the nation of Israel. It's entitled, "Arab Spring Will Just Bring Upon Islamist Dictatorships." Okay, now let me make sure you understand what's going on. Arab Spring will just bring Islamist dictatorships. Now, here's the logic, and it makes incredible sense to me. Listen to it carefully as we go forward. So you were thinking that the so-called Arab Spring was going to fix the problems in the Islamic part of the world. The first part of the article points out that the United Nations Development Program's 2002 Arab Human Development Report stated that deeply rooted shortcomings existed in Arab countries. In other words, Arab societies were sick. They had built-in problems. According to the report, this sickness was reflected in the lack of respect for human rights and freedoms, the status of Arab women, and the poor state of knowledge acquisition in its effective utilization. Now, the follow-up report in 2003 makes it a little more clear. It stated, true democracy is absent and desperately needed. The educational system is severely retarded. Schools produce ignorant young men and women. Most of the Arab intellectuals realize, even if they deny it, that most of what was said in the most recent Arab Human Development Report is true. So, if you're thinking that the so-called Arab Spring was going to fix all that, well, you'd better think again. It looks like the Arab Spring will be followed by an Arab winter. Now, follow this logic because it's so interesting. On second thought, this is a development that was entirely predictable. The Islamists are going to inherit the mantle of the dictators. Zayn el-Abidine bin Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya were corrupt dictators who outlived their days. They all suppressed the Islamic movements in their respective countries and were all thus on the side of the seculars in their own perverse way. The same holds true for Syria's Bashar Assad, whose father, Hafez, killed some 20,000 people in the city of Hama in 1982, quelling a rebellion by the Muslim Brothers. Now his son Bashar, no less ruthless, seems to be about to go the way of bin Ali, Mubarak, and Gaddafi. The demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt were initially led by secular groups, educated youngsters adept at using the internet, Facebook, and Twitter. In Egypt, they stood shoulder to shoulder with members of the Coptic Christian community, which constitutes 10% of the Egyptian population. Quite naturally, they called for the downfall of Mubarak to be followed by democratic elections. The motley crew in Libya that overthrew Gaddafi was supported by the democracies that make up NATO, and it is unimaginable that the bloodbath that rid the country of the mad dog of the Middle East, as former U.S. President Ronald Reagan called Gaddafi, would not be followed by democratic elections, even under the chaotic conditions that followed Gaddafi's downfall. But who is going to win the elections when they take place? Now, here's the big question. In Egypt, in Libya, and eventually in Syria, we already have a preview. In Tunisia, the country that had been the most secular and westernized of the Arab states, the election was won by the Ennahda, which is the Islamic party similar to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The Ennahda, with the advocates of a secular Tunisia, left far behind. The Western media, in an attempt to put a good face on what has clearly been a disappointing outcome, insist on calling Ennahda a mildly Islamic party. But the facts are there for all to see. Tunisia is coming under Islamic rule, and there is no reason to expect a different outcome in Egypt, Libya, or Syria when elections are held there. A wave of Islamic rule, with all it entails, is sweeping across the Arab world. It will replace secular dictatorships with Islamic ones. We should have expected nothing else. Okay, so Tunisia, it's already happened. It is acknowledged that the Muslim Brotherhood is the most powerful single force in Egypt today. They're moving toward elections probably sooner rather than later. And when that happens, what will happen? Well, it appears certain, as the article says, that the Muslims will win the day again. Let's look a little bit further. Demography has been hard at work all through the past years. For those who haven't noticed, during the long years of totalitarian rule in the Arab states, the population that was fervently Muslim increased in numbers much faster than the secular population. Now, the veiled women far outnumber those willing to show their faces in public, to such an extent that there is no need to await the counting of the ballots after Election Day. The outcome of the elections in the Arab countries is certain before the votes have been cast. Observers may fool themselves into believing that the Islamic parties contesting the elections in the Arab countries are mildly Islamic or moderate Islamist, but their leaders are neither mild nor moderate, clearly expecting the basic faults that characterize Arab societies as described in the UNDP Arab Human Development Reports. To be rectified under the rule of Islamic parties is no more than a vain hope. If anything, the opposite is most likely to be true. Sharia law will prevail with all it entails. The toppling of the Arab dictators was inevitable. Unfortunately, however, just as inevitable is what is going to follow their overthrow. It looks like it's going to be a long Arab winter. Of all the articles I've read, and that's hundreds of them over the last year, trying to decipher what's really going on here, this article summed it up the best, analyzed it the best. Of course, we've got the advantage of 9 or 10 months of history now, watching what is in fact happening. But I think it was so telling that the article points out that the secular dictators, Mubarak, Bashar Assad, Gaddafi, they all used their power to hold down the Islamic wave and to rule in somewhat of a secular way. However, with their removal and with the attempt to implement democratic reforms, to throw things open to a vote, the bottom line is the Islamic factor appears to have already won. Once they have their elections and Islam is voted in as the reigning power, will it tolerate minorities? Will it tolerate the Christian minority? Will it tolerate the secular minority? Well, we know what happens in other countries when Islam rules. They don't tolerate anyone but themselves. So that remains to be seen how it's going to work in all these situations. But it appears that the outcome of what looked like was a promising Arab Spring, in fact, is going to descend into the Islamic winter. Now, that makes us ask a couple of questions here. Our government sponsored and supported the revolution. We told Mubarak he had to step aside. We put all of our muscle behind NATO and the overthrow of Gaddafi. Now we're calling for the removal of Assad. So why? Is this because we have no discernment as to where this ends up? Because it's going to end up worse than it started. The only other possibility is that we want it to end up. We know there have been murmurings, messages passed under the table that Barack Obama is pro-Islam. Of course, we know he attended an Islamic school for at least a couple of years of his life. We know his father was a lifelong Muslim. So you have to scratch your head and say, is there a chance that he really has pro-Islamic tendencies? I'm not accusing him. I don't know the answer to this. But there are many people who claim. Now, I will confess to you that I had a certain level of alarm sweep through me when I heard him say in his famous Cairo speech, I have heard the call to prayer. He called it by its Muslim name. I don't remember what that is, but he said, I have heard the call to prayer. He said it's the most beautiful sound on earth. Now, here's a man who claims to be a Christian. Christians believe Jesus was God manifest in the flesh. Muslims deny that Jesus was God at all. So here is a man who says of a religion that denies the very tenet of Christianity, that their call to prayer is the most beautiful sound on earth. And it makes me scratch my head and say, is there a chance that some of these rumors could in fact be true? I don't know the answer to it. I'll just tell you. But I have a feeling the answer is going to come out as we continue down this road. Hope it doesn't come out too late. Well, you're listening to Politics and Religion today, and we're talking about what's really behind the Arab Spring. We'll have a lot of other things to say and take your calls.